are, whoops, damn. Welcome to Evolution Hour. Here we are on the wee hours of the 3rd of June, 2024. And don't forget our WordPress.com. I'm being a little bit quieter here because we have some relatives over from Seattle over the weekend for a variety of things. And I want to keep it a little bit of quiet because people sleeping around in the next room. But bon appetit on the iced tea. Anyway, hopefully that'll be adequate enough. Our latest episode, of course, we're now into the Sauropods section of Sarfatientae, and it's kind of a fun little operation as usual. And there will be a part 2 on some ceratopsids from a dear old CMI. Anyway, so they launch into the sauropods, and the first thing I wanted to do was to find out just how many they have in the total chapter and how many families are involved, or presumably, therefore, kinds. And they've got 22 examples, which is a little bit more than they had in the theropod section, but they only fall into about as many families as 10. And indeed, half of their examples are duplications of just 2 families, Diplodocids and Titanosaurs. And they start off with a very early semi-large one that doesn't fall into either one of those camps, Ingentia, which was only described by a 2018 paper, which they cite, and I'll be putting up a link to that. And they weren't bringing it up to investigate the phylogeny of these particular taxa, or whether or not how they would decide what similar cousins might be, and whether or not they might be falling into the same kind or not. We have no clue. No, it was to cast doubt on a point that was entirely irrelevant, because they point out that a very large synapsid exists from 237 million years ago, 30 million years before this first of the slightly large sauropods are showing up, and that this is somehow a problem for an evolutionary model. No, not really. But the fun part is to look at the actual paper involved, Suledge 2019, which I'll be putting a link up because it's open access. The paper doesn't say it. They date to 237 million years ago. Oh, hi, Purple. Yeah, greetings, sentient beings. In fact, it dates to 208 million years ago. Plain as day in the paper. The favorite group of dinosaurs, yes, the 2 giants. Well, that's going to be the interesting issue, Purple, is about the giantism aspect versus did they start out that way? And the neat part is that of all, they leave out so many of the kinds that theoretically they could be in there. Yes, I love the GOP freak out on the indicted one now becoming the convicted one. Yes, that's we've all been talking about in our family and others for the interesting thing to see all the little Trumpistas lining up in a row. It's pathetic, but not unsurprising. Tom Cotton and Mike Johnson and all the rest, and of course all the family clan, Laura Trump and all that. They're everything they're saying is entirely to be expected. Anyway, back to sauropods. For those who are aware of the details of sauropods and sauropodomorphs and all the rest, the earliest groups of these things aren't terribly large. They're eventually get to be bigger ones over millions of years. But there's a whole graded series of progressively larger ones. And they do mention, our Sarfatientae do allude to the plateosaurids, one example of that, which are much smaller, roughly cow size kind of things, which may also have been able to walk on hind legs and all that because they're much lighter weight as opposed to the firmly on all fours sauropods. But taxonomically farther back are groups like the Anchisaurids, which are not on Sarfatientae's list at all. So I'll be putting up a 2010 paper from Yates, which will give some context on those little ones. A very nice little paper, a revision of the problematic sauropod amorph dinosaurs from Connecticut, of all places. And they're going into, well, this particular example that they're describing, which is a fragmentary one, and then also a breakdown as to the size distribution over time, which, needless to say, doesn't fit into the younger creationist format. But anyway, the funky part, oh, yes, this was in, well, that's what I was showing there. That's from the Apple Dedi paper. My mistake, my bad. Here is the one on the Soulege paper, which does not date to 237 million years ago. Also, a bunch of chronological material in there. So that's another one that I would guess they are misrepresenting the contents. And then the Yates paper, which has quite a detailed mass of the phylogenies involved, which will sort a lot of that stuff out. Oh, sorry to hear that, Lisa. Oh, yes. Part 2 is also dinosaur stuff. But anyway, in the coming weeks, then, we'll be going through taxa by taxa by taxa. A chunk of them seem to have relatively little referencing at all, which is always intriguing, or peripherally secondary material like this Ingentia material. But there will be some on the Rebeccasaurids and stuff, and when we get down later on, we'll want to dive into those in greater detail. But so you clearly have an example of the creationists simply leaving out parts they don't want to think about, and that simplifies the model greatly. Her name now starting to put it up as a Nee Cosner. Creation for Kids. This is a series of papers that are in their little creation magazine. And the funky part is it's relating to ceratopsids. And they put up a cute little chart which lists a bunch of ceratopsids, and they are intimating all of these are the same kind. Well, I immediately noticed Leptoceratops and Montanaceratops, which are very small in the Protoceratopsid range. And in fact, over time, there's been a tendency, as more fossils have been developed, that they are putting these in the basal family Leptoceratopsidae, which is morphologically in between the Protoceratopsids and the later Ceratopsids. Now, what's ironic is the ARC encounter, parasitizing off of the more recent systematics, treats that group as a separate kind. But CMI apparently hasn't cut the wind, and so they're lumping them together as all the same kind, just because they look pretty much like ceratopsids, which indeed they do, except, of course, they're much smaller than the forms that we see with Triceratops. So all that matter of size and scale, what you start out, the Psittacosaurids, which are the first one with that parrot beak front end, that are small bipedal critters that are all in Asia. And then the Protoceratopsids come about, and they start spreading to some extent over into the Americas, because they were connected by a land bridge at that time. And then the full ceratopsids are looking like they're pretty much developing in that little area west of the big seaway that split up the North American continent at that time, which is why there are no ceratopsids known from across the water in what would be eastern North America. But they do, there's one taxa that spills back over into China. So you have a biogeographical relationship and a phylogenetic relationship and all that deliciously available. Anyway, so we'll be putting some material in to fill some of these little pictures in on the ceratopsids. There's Eoceratops, which has a very spotty history. That's another one. It's now recognized as a Chasmosaurus, which is listed as a separate taxa in their stupid picture. And there's a 2010 paper from Tanky on that I'll be putting up. The bounding picture of that whole ceratopsid bunch is getting to be much more complicated. And there would have been plenty of papers, which we'll find out whether or not any of these things get cited in other material, but I can tell you as a spoiler alert, they're not cited in Sarfatientae, because I went ahead and glanced into that chapter to find out whether Zheng's 2015 paper from Nature on some new Chinese finds, or Campbell 2016 from PLOS One, or Fowler 2020 at Peer J. All of those predate the Sarfatientae book. All are directly relevant to the systematics and paleontology of ceratopsids, and not one of them show up on their list. Haha. Well, we'll find out the details of what they do think to put up on the list. Oh gosh, yes. In fact, the whole bit of some of the critters, of course, the part of the dodge that is used, certainly in the Duane Gish era, and to some extent that's adapted in modern creationism, more recent creationism, is they simply think that they're little babies on board. So you got a little baby sauropod. And they don't tend to think a great deal about the ankylosaurids, and a lot of the hadrosaurs get mixed out. They're really superficial on the details on these things. But quite a few of these critters, anything big enough, particularly that example from the synapsids, that's the size of an elephant, that unless they're all little babies, that's a hell of a lot of mass to deal with. But if you simply leave out most of the details, then you don't have to worry about all of that. So it's funky that some of the creationist modeling of the Ark that's been along has kind of played fast and loose with stuff. I'll give the Ark Encounter A for effort, in that they've recognized that they have a limited volume on board, and therefore there's only so many stall space they can deal with. They can theoretically put little critters in, and snakes in buckets or something, that to deal with that kind of stuff. And they're not worrying about the vast majority with all those insects that they have to worry about. They just don't bother about any of that stuff. Marine taxa that theoretically would require being aboard, like pinnipeds and others, they're not really thinking about that either. But as it is, they've forced to keep the number of kinds low. So by having it only in that 1,400 some odd range, the numbers can theoretically kind of sort of add up. Although there's so many different ways when you start looking at the physical details. For example, one of the things that we'll have a whole little info box on in the new book will be on the trope that the average critter on board the Ark is the size of a sheep. And that is a complicated problem to think about in terms of how many animals you would have on board, even if you have the volume of a sheep. And some of the analyses that have been done that tried to make sense out of this stuff just thought of it in terms of gross volume, like you were packing sheep together in like cordwood without any spacings between them, that these were untenably peculiar numbers. In a way, another thing that indicates why the Ark Encounter is such a mess has to do with how many people were available to handle it all. They don't have a staff of 8 at the Ark Encounter to handle their little zoo of animals, their tiny little smattering of animals that they have in their little petting zoo in there. And needless to say, they don't have a bunch of geriatric people, although supposedly, Noah and the kids, even though they're hundreds of years old, are supposedly much fitter than the 71-year-old person from our time. I don't know about that little part. And then, of course, some of the details about eccentric food structure. We'll be having material on John Woodmarapp's dervish arguments to deal with the specialized diets of koala bears and things like that. It's striking how few examples of these pop up in the creationist literature of the creationist even trying to think about it. And then when they do try to think about it, it's pretty strained and tendentious arguments that don't fit the technical details, which by and large they don't deal with. If Pangea was right before the flood, why are dinosaur fossils localized? That is another absolutely fascinating example and brings to mind the whole issue of what did the pre-flood world look like. What we have is a little bit of a dispute that's going on. If you go to the Creation Museum, they think the pre-flood world was Rodinia, not Pangea, and that during the course of the flood, the continents jiggled poked around to form Pangea at some point during the big slosh, and then very quickly afterwards, it's reforming and pulling apart to form our present continental structure, throwing up big mountain ranges, because remember, there's only so much water they can have available. So they've had to maintain a low water line. This was basically the argument that started coming along in creationism from the 1980s on, as they began to argue that the higher mountains weren't there at all. So they have to have Mount Ararat at the top. And indeed, then Andrew Snelling comes along most recently and contends even Mount Ararat is post-flood. So they can't even be there. That in his latest apologetics, he's not even claiming that Mount Ararat was there for the ark to land on, which then gets back to where does he think all of this is? But anyway, most of your average creationists who aren't following the Ark Encounter AIG party line are indeed taking the argument that Pangea would be the pre-flood world and then our world came afterwards. But are you going to get geographical inflation as we move into the 21st century, of where some creationists will decide to go with the Rodinia model, and then will others figure out what to do with the previous Columbia supercontinent and the ones before that? Because it's looking like there's been multiple supercontinents and on about a 600 million year formation cycle, of which we have fragmentary data the farther back you go in time, because there's so few rocks available to look at, but they can piece together some of the pieces on the thing. The fiddly bit details of the geographical landscape is never making any sense. And that's why when you have these discussions at all and they name drop Pangea, they're not going into any detail. There's virtually no analysis that goes into a rigorous depiction of what they think the pre-flood layout looks like in relating it to actual deposition. And one of the things that's going to be an info box in the new book will relate to the region I live in, which is the Pacific Northwest. And apart from brief mentions of Mount St. Helens and the Columbia basalt and the Missoula floods, those get alluded to and mangled. But the vast majority of the geology of the Pacific Northwest is enormously interesting and complicated. And I'd love to see Ord or Clary or Snelling or Woodmarapp try to ferret their way through the little fiddly bit details of the exotic terrains and details of the rock formations that can be seen buried as pieces in the Cascades and all through the Pacific Northwest and into British Columbia. It's an absolutely delicious amount of material, and virtually none of it is alluded to in the creationist literature. They just bypass this thing completely. But the actual geologists have been able to make such delicious sense of the details of how the continents have been forming, the turning of the North American continent and all of that, all of which it requires time. And of course, a detail that gets missed completely in that paleo context, but is known a little bit in the upper echelon creationist ones, and they try not to think about it too much, is the fact that if you move rocks around too fast, you get too much heat. And if you start totaling up all the stuff, which Gutsick Gibbons has done, and various other people have done calculations to put together all the numbers, it's melting the planet. It's just preposterously hot. And so you can't pull that material off. But that's on top of all the geologic problem of trying to figure out why strips of the old red sandstone are buried up in the Pacific Northwest, and why chunks of the volcanic terrain, Silesia, which was presumably parked out in the Pacific Ocean, ends up in the forms where parts of it split apart, and it's up in the British Columbia, and part of it's in the Cascades. How the hell can you pull any of that off? And for that matter, what did the pre-flood world look like? So anybody that wants to look into this can try to find anywhere in the professional creationist literature or in any of their generic apologetics that try to depict on a map what the pre-flood world looked like, and to have a breakdown of this is what happened, and then this is moving over here, and that's moving over there. You get very detailed analyses of landmass movements and fault formations and that in the regular geological literature, but yet none of the sparse group of creationist pseudo-geologists ever get to that level. It's just all a cartoon level. Now, if anybody knows of any counterexamples to that, if Colton catches the show or anybody else that's in this area and you're aware of any analysis to the contrary, please bring it to my attention, because I don't know of any. And I would contend that it's not possible for them to ever do that. Just eyeballing the Grand Canyon debunks the flunk. Yeah, it's of course, the Grand Canyon is the poster child from the creationist point of view. They are absolutely convinced that the Grand Canyon is a flood deposit. And it's hilarious to watch how not too close to the details they get. They'll just deal with, to some extent, authority quotes and just other things. The unconformity, the great unconformity is the typical one. But as anybody that studied this in detail knows, the unconformity is simply where you have a period when you've got a lot of erosion going on over deposition. And so if you imagine a layer cake forming over time, and then erosion comes along and starts removing deposits, so that means the amount of time that was represented by that disappears because it's being eroded away. La-di-da. Well, the landscape is a landscape. And as you move down the Grand Canyon, you start encountering some of the remaining deposits that were in that gap in between those upper layer and lower layer. It's not present in most of the canyon because most of it eroded, but there's little slivers of it at the far end. And no creationist literature that I know of addresses that little aspect. And of course, the other issue is, why is the canyon shaped the way it is? It's got meanderings and all the rest, which, why would a flood produce that? Well, they're actually forced into a strange cartoon form, because remember, they've got to argue, and it's forced by the logic of their position, because there's the deposits that are laid down that have fossils in them. So that has to be flood layer. And then where does the canyon come from? Well, if they're not turned into rock, then why do we not get a slurry that just gets sloshed away? Oh, yes, if I can strongly recommend, if you can ever get a chance to do the Grand Canyon, and frankly, it will be impossible to do it just once, because the area is very big, and there's just so much to see. I visited it quite a few times, and only in the last visit, that when we had the time where we were spending a week in the region, did we get some chances to actually go, Colton and I, on almost our last day there, trek down the trails down a ways to actually see down into the canyon. The distance to go for hiking to get down into the actual bottom of the canyon is stuff that, for all practical purposes, you've got to stay over either in one of the little lodges that they have down there, and the reservations apparently are zillions of years in advance on those, or camping spots also, of which have to be reserved and all that. And I'm not a camper. But the canyon is such a ginormous thing, and you've got two halves of it. You've got the south rim and the north rim. And it was many times before I finally got a chance to visit the North Rim, which I did, it's been like 20 years or more ago. The North Rim is higher Whereas the south rim, I think that the most recent rocks in there are like in the Cretaceous period and that. But you start getting Jurassic rocks that have not eroded away. That's in the part as you move northwards into Zion Canyon and Bryce Canyon and all that kind of stuff. The North Canyon being much higher, when we visited it in, I think, May of 80 something or other when we were down there. Um, it was literally the first day that they opened the roads because it snows in there and it was wintertime and they had just plowed the things open and the place had opened up. The most scenic viewpoints and the like are on the south rim. That's the more popular one. They're much more ecologically balanced nowadays compared to the way they were the earlier times because they've now eliminated all car traffic. If you drive in by a car, you park your vehicles and then you make use of little electric shuttles that zip around in the park. And they're on a constant bit. They're really easy to get around with and all that. We were visiting at the tail end of the COVID pandemic, so masks were required and a lot of things like that. But it's a thing that is absolutely spectacular to see, and the displays in the various science museums that are along the route. You can visit it practically any time of year and find something interesting on it. There are artists and others who love coming to the canyon in varying seasons because what you see in the spring is different than the summer. We were there for the big adventure with our geology bunch there during the pandemic. It was around October, which was the latest that I'd ever been. We'd always visited in the summertime. And it was a very different environment. And I was also quite surprised how many people were there, in spite of the fact that we were coming off the tail end of the pandemic. The long lines to enter into the park and all that material. But ideally, if you can stay in one of the big lodges that are right on the rim, that's a stupendous thing. And if you can stay a few days, at least that gives you a chance to be able to really work your way along and follow the hiking trails and go through all the various museums and all that. You know, this Grand Canyon is this thing that you could never visit it too many times. And then you've got all the other real estate that's in the other areas, Zion and all that going up into Utah. We would organize our trips so that we would be coming down and pick off some of those other geologic sites before getting to the Grand Canyon, which you have to. The Grand Canyon is awkward to come in by driving no matter what. You got to go around via Las Vegas, or you could come down through Utah and come in from the back end along what is now the dwindling Glen Canyon Dam lake. Boy, was it low at times, and it's gotten progressively lower and may reach the point where they'll have to take the dam out because water levels on the Colorado are getting so low because of the amount of water that's being drawn off on it, and that's another little side issue. Yeah, the Mount St. Helens example there, I have had a chance to visit there. Our family went zipping into St. Helens literally the first day they opened it up in, I think it was July of 1980, to see what was going on there. What you have is the blast went out in a very focused cataclysm that dumped masses of the mountain in a pyroclastic flow along that eruptive line, roughly like a big fan. And that blocked off the river. And so it ended up with, and also flooding from stuff that swept down the street, down the Toutle River into the coast and washing out the freeway and did a bunch of stuff. So it's basically vast pyroclastic flows, which is eroding away because it's all in the once the river starts going, and they've done also dredging in that to release these big log jam dams that came up as the forests got blunked and the lake got moved, plonk, all that water was shifted over and produced a temporary mess that they had to cut things to be able to bleed the water off of. It's not going to be there indefinitely, and nature, of course, they've been doing deliberate plantings around the periphery, except for the immediate area around the volcano itself that has been kept in complete pristine condition. There's a brand new paper that's come out that we're going to be alluding to in volume 2 on the whole issue of lithification. And that gets us back to the problem that the Grand Canyon has, is that in order for there to be a canyon there, you have to have all of this slurry that comes in during the flood. And then it has to turn into rock so that it's hard enough for the canyon to be carved by some hypothetical post-flood lake that breaches. That's the typical argument. Well, it's been pretty much scotched that there was any lake structure to do any of that. No, the canyon is formed from river, and it's an incised canyon, which is like this, not steep walled vertical canyons like we find up in the Columbia Gorge from our fast Missoula flooding, which basically scours everything down until it hits the really hard volcanic rock, the super hard volcanic rock of the Grand Ronde. Anybody that's been to the Columbia Gorge is never going to confuse it for the Grand Canyon, because they look totally different, and that's because the mechanisms are different. What forms incised canyons is well known, and we alluded to it in volume 1. It's that if you have a river coming in and it goes downstream, and you form various things, a nice normal flow of river. But if the differential between the top and the bottom starts shifting faster than the river can erode it, then you get these incised canyons. Now, there's a couple ways you can do that. One way is for the sea level to drop, and that's what happened when the Mediterranean Sea dried up, and we alluded to that in volume 1. Where a whole slew of mini Grand Canyons, including the gorge that the Nile River is in currently, were cut as the Mediterranean Sea dropped in a hurry about 5 million years ago, so that as the Gibraltar Strait got blacked off, and there are relatively few rivers that go into the Mediterranean Sea, and it was a warm climate, and so the amount of water coming in meant that the Mediterranean was evaporating faster than the rivers could build it out. And eventually it got down to smaller lakes and the like. And so there's a whole slew. I think the Rhone River and I can't remember the Po was in that, but and even all the way up to the Volga, there are even these incised canyons coming off of that as the various drainage systems are coming into the shrinking Mediterranean. Well, the Grand Canyon is the opposite of that. Its headwaters are being pushed up with the Columbia Plateau. And so the land is rising higher, and the outlet is pretty much staying the same at sea level, and that's why you get incised canyon in the Grand Canyon. We know where the sediment ended up. Most of it was coming right down. At the time, there was some shifting because of the San Andreas Fault. A lot of the sediment was landing at what is now changed position because the fault lines have been moving, and they've been able to locate a lot of that stuff, just in the same way that we know the sediment and gunk that was dumped downstream from the Columbia floods ended up, some of it backwashing up into Eugene, Oregon, and other places all the way out into the escarpment off at the beyond where the mouth of the Columbia River is. Huge amount of geologic information that's been done on this, which, surprise, surprise, isn't being discussed by creationists. So the Grand Canyon's hardly unique, and those who buy Rocks for Their Volume 1 will get a whole slew of material on that, the Messinian, if you look it up in the index, the Messinian salinity crisis. Boop. I think that's how it's spelled. Because, you see, they had all of this salt deposits at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. Well, how the hell can that form? Well, it wasn't underwater at the time. It was desiccating. And so there's been a lot of back and forth as to whether the whole Mediterranean completely dried up or whether there were pockets of lakes and things that were in various zones. And I think the Po River fitted into the pit. that there was like lake structures and things that were occurring. So there's been an ongoing set of research which is almost entirely ignored in creationist literature. And so if you want to look at the Nile River was a particularly fascinating example because, of course, the Nile River now is a slow, lazy surface river with a lot of sediment underneath it. And just how much sediment the Russians discovered when they were come in to help Nasser build the Aswan High Dam back in the 1960s, I think. Because in order to build the dam, they needed to be able to find bedrock. And so they were doing all sorts of soundings and probes, and they discovered that buried in the current valley of the Nile is a 900-foot deep canyon that was carved when the Messinian salinity crisis came along. And after that started to end and the Mediterranean refilled, well, for a while there would have been a huge estuary that would be now filled in Nile Canyon at sea level. And actually, over the millions of years since, the Nile River has kept on depositing stuff and filled all of that stuff up to the point of where it's a relatively shallow river today. So it's absolutely fascinating stuff. Yes, Billy John of the Man because it was at the shore when the sea. Well, there's been bits and pieces. I think there's a famous example that I think Charles Lyell mentioned of a place where the water was encroaching because individual spots along a sea coast can subside. The Alexandrian Egypt of Cleopatra, most of it's underwater because there are uplifts. It's tectonically active region. The Messinian salinity crisis is millions of years ago. So the only people who could have seen that in the giant Gibraltar Falls that refilled the Mediterranean over like 100 years would have been hominids, and they weren't in a position to be able to take much nibble at. They lived too far south. I will agree totally on this political matter of the fundamentalists and their threat to the country. We're going to have an extremely exciting time in the next 6 months. Get out the vote, and particularly in states that are potentially swing states, if you lived in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, Michigan, and also Georgia and Arizona and Nevada, there's quite a few states that are really big swing ones, and in any of the states, but certainly you want to make sure you're registered and you want to make sure you vote, because depending on distribution of the votes, that's how Donald Trump got to be president in 2016, because the Electoral College swung it in his favor, even though he got fewer votes than Hillary Clinton. 2020 was at least less of a squeaker because the vote was such that Biden won both the popular vote and the full electoral vote by exactly the same amount, ironically enough, as Trump had won in 2016. And of course, Trump then went on to lie and say that he actually won it after all. And anybody that knows Trump's background knows that this was going to be what he was going to do. When he was before he was really serious in the race, he would argue in 2015 on that he can't lose an election. If he doesn't win it, it must be because there was fraud. So, it goes on. Yes, Minnesota, pretty solidly blue. Yeah, they take nothing for granted, in other words. And voter turnout, Rob Reiner has been predicting hopefully that there'll be 100 million votes for Biden this time, which would mean close to 20 million more people voting. But we certainly have the voters out there to do that. There's roughly 100 million voters who did not vote in 2020, and they're above voting age, and they could easily do so. And so this is an example that on state level as well. Another reason is that because, a lot of these little nutballs that are running for court positions, they're running for state House positions, they're running for a variety of secretaries of state and others. The Looney Tunes Trumpistas want to take control of all of that stuff, so that if they're holding the levers of power, if they're the ones that decides how the Electoral College is working out and how electors are chosen and all that, then they can cheat their way to a victory even without having the votes on their side. Yes, this one is the Georgia and also Arizona case are both ones that are going to be adjudicated. Really important, that power. Okay, we're still our signal is getting a little bit murkier. Let me put on my show and tell from our patrons, without whom our little project would not be feasible. And I am constantly delighted at the people that give us a thumbs up every month at whatever level they can do, and a little bit here. Safety in numbers. The more people who help along the project, the better it is to deal with it. I'm not nearly at the state that quite a few video people have, where they've got super chat donations directly, and their entire livelihood is Patreon. Well, I'm still largely Social Security, and then I have some book royalties from the books, and our material from the okay, there we go. Remember, every week the show will have not only the links to the papers that I've been discussing, but links to all the books, and then also the link to the Patreon account, as well as the link to the Troubles in Paradise website, where there's all that stuff. If you aren't in a position to be able to help the channel as a patron or buying the books, you can download a ton of stuff, freebie, at the website. That's what it's for. So, yes, well, where the signal's back up. Most of the time, the newer format that I got, the little box that I have that's hitchhiking off of their networking systems, operates at the full signal range. Once in a while, there's some quibbles, and I think to sometime it's not my internet provider that's the matter. It's sometimes glitches from the restream, or there may be times when a zillion people are trying to do things all at the same time. That was one of the reasons why it was kind of different to do it at other times a day, because there's just too many people on there. So hard to get into the queue at their end to be able to handle that, because I'm operating off of the freebie system. I'm not paying money at that level. I'm not at the Go Pro level. So let me put the commercial up for our book that Peter did. And let's get our little share screen again. And let that little commercial run. We're terribly proud of Volume 1, and Volume 2 will be just juicy. And of course, bring you up to date for the years after that, because just as the first book was quite current as to 2020 when we did it, this one will be quite current as to 2024, 2025, as we're completing all of that. So there's tons of new material that's we're plugging in at every turn to keep it up to speed, so that it will be as viable a resource base as there. And then we, of course, can move on to subsequent book projects, which Jackson and I have in the works. So so long as we're we've got our supporters and we've got our faculties about us and the like. We are busy beavers working on all these different projects, and I'm having a delightful time, and I'm hoping you're having a delightful time listening to this old fart give you the skivvy about where we are on things, and follow the sources at all times. I think nobody in 2024 has any legitimate excuse being a scientific illiterate boob when it comes to any issues, because the information is too easily available in too many venues. Now, if they rely on stupid people, then naturally they can arrive at stupid conclusions. But there's no excuse for that if you start following the sources, because when you look at it at the source level, you can tell the difference between a rigorous sound analysis and a claptrap. So there we go. So we got 45-minute show in. I think that will work out fairly well. Yes, the whale penis guy. Exactly. Yes, that's he goes where I fear to tread. Anyway, everybody stay safe. Watch out for the wooden penguins if you're in zones of looking like for long-term June weather forecasting. There's going to be a big heat dome that's going to be slamming through most of the United States, and will be above seasonal temperatures here in Spokane. There'll be a lot of places that will also be above seasonal temperatures, and that means hot, hot, hot for the Southwest and Texas and places like that. So gear up and be safe and maintain air conditioning and so forth and so on. And anyway, we will all see you folks next week, when there will be another episode of the Casey Luskin Brigade. So till next week, everybody stay safe, and